If anyone leaves them here tonight, they'll die, I said out loud, louder than I meant to, startling even myself as I looked down at the two tiny puppies trembling in the cardboard box by the gas station trash bins. Their fur was damp, their bodies pressed so tightly together you could barely tell where one ended and the other began. They had no collars, no blanket, nothing but each other. My hands shook as I bent down, because something inside me knew that this was going to change everything about my life. It was late evening in Maple Creek, a small town in the Midwest, where the most excitement you'd usually see was the Friday night football game or the annual harvest parade. I had just finished filling my car with gas when I noticed the faint sound, almost like squeaking wheels. But then I realized it was whimpering. I walked toward the noise, and there they were. Two puppies with round, frightened eyes, so small they looked like they hadn't been weaned long. Their paws were caked with dirt, their bellies thin. I could see the rapid rise and fall of their chests as they clung to each other. The sight made my heart pound in my ears. I called out to the man at the counter inside the gas station, a tall guy with a baseball cap who'd been checking receipts. "Do you know anything about these puppies out here?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, ma'am. Someone must have left them. Folks do that sometimes, but I've never seen pups this little left in a box before." His words made my stomach twist. I knelt back beside the box, unsure of what to do. I wasn't planning on getting a duh. I lived in a modest house on the edge of town with a small yard. Nothing special. But the way these two stared at me, as if begging for something beyond food or shelter, tugged at something deep. I whispered, "It's okay now. I've got you." Their tails didn't wag. They were too weak for that. Instead, one nuzzled closer into the other's fur, as if holding on to the only piece of safety it knew. A woman walking her child home from the grocery store paused nearby. "Oh my goodness, are those puppies? Are they all right?" she asked, bending slightly to look. Her little boy gasped and clutched her hand tighter. "They look so scared, Mommy." Other people coming and going from the pumps began to notice too, drawn by the sight of the two fragile lives huddled together. Soon a small circle of strangers stood around us, their faces carrying the same mixture of worry and wonder I felt. "They're just babies," an older man said, leaning on his cane. "They won't make it out here overnight. Coyotes come around here after dark. Someone's got to do something." I swallowed hard. I realized everyone's eyes had turned to me because I was kneeling closest. My throat tightened. It was like the choice had already been made for me. Carefully, I lifted the puppies from the box. They were so light I could hold both in one arm. Their bodies trembled against me, and I could feel their little hearts beating fast. One had soft golden fur with white-tipped paws, while the other was darker brown with a faint streak down its nose. They looked like siblings, or at least companions who'd been through the same ordeal. The crowd murmured softly, some shaking their heads at the cruelty of whoever abandoned them. Others smiled faintly, as though relieved someone was stepping in. A young woman with a baby carrier adjusted the strap over her shoulder and said, "You're saving their lives right now. Don't let go of them." Her words struck me harder than I expected. I realized how fragile this moment was, how close they'd come to being lost, and how incredible it was that a handful of strangers were standing together in this unremarkable parking lot, united by the simple hope that two forgotten puppies would live. I carried them to my car and set them gently on the passenger seat. For a moment they sat frozen, still pressed together, until one gave the tiniest whine and licked the other's ear. My chest ached at the sight. I turned back toward the gas station, where the little group of onlookers still lingered. I raised a hand and said, "Thank you all for noticing them with me. They'll be safe now." The older man nodded, the mother smiled, and the boy waved at the pups through the window as I closed the car door. Driving home, I couldn't stop glancing at them. Every red light, every stop sign. I found myself studying the way they clung together. It was more than survival. It was love. A kind of bond that didn't need words. I thought about what the old man had said, that they wouldn't have made it overnight. My heart swelled with both sorrow for what they'd faced and hope for what could come next. When we arrived at my small white house with the chipped paint along the porch, I carried them inside and set them on an old blanket by the couch. They looked around cautiously, sniffing the air, but never letting go of each other. I quickly filled a bowl with water and set it down. At first, they just stared, but after a few moments, the golden one leaned forward, lapping noisily, while the brown one followed timidly. Watching them drink felt like watching life return in real time. I had no supplies, no dog food, not even a collar. I rummaged through my pantry and found some plain boiled chicken left over from dinner, shredding it carefully into tiny pieces. I set the plate near the blanket. The smell must have stirred something inside them, because they shuffled forward together, paws brushing, and began to eat hungrily. I sat cross-legged nearby, tears prickling my eyes as I whispered, "You're safe now. I promise." That first night, I couldn't bring myself to leave them alone. I lay down on the floor beside the blanket, listening to the soft sounds of their breathing once they finally drifted to sleep. At one point, the brown pup stretched slightly, pressing closer against my arm as if testing whether I would move away. I didn't. Instead, I let them know through my stillness that I wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, and I woke to find them sitting up together, eyes brighter than the night before. For the first time, their tails wagged, just barely, but enough to make me laugh with relief. I sat up and rubbed my eyes. "Good morning, you two," I said softly. They patted closer, their paws making the tiniest sounds against the wood floor. And before I knew it, one had climbed into my lap, while the other rested its chin on my knee. I knew then that the moment outside the gas station wasn't just about saving them. It was about them saving me too, in a way I hadn't even realized I needed. The loneliness of my house seemed to lift as their little bodies warmed mine. And though I didn't know what the future held, I felt certain of one thing. This was the beginning of something unforgettable, not just for me, but for everyone who had witnessed that night, when two helpless puppies clung to each other and a group of strangers stood together to make sure they lived. "I guess I'm a dog mom now," I muttered to myself as I stood in the middle of my kitchen that morning, watching the two puppies explore their new world with hesitant steps. Their tiny paws clicked softly against the wooden floor as they sniffed every corner, tails starting to wag more freely now that they weren't shivering in fear. The golden one, who seemed slightly bolder, ventured toward the pantry, while the brown pup followed close behind, glancing back at me every few seconds, as if needing reassurance. I knelt down, holding out my hand, and they came running, tumbling over each other until they crashed into my lap. I laughed out loud, the sound surprising even me, because it had been so long since my house had echoed with that kind of joy. The first challenge was figuring out what to call them. Names seemed too important to rush, but I also felt that they deserved identities beyond the golden one and the brown one. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, I studied them carefully. The golden pup had a way of nudging forward with curiosity, his nose always in something new, while the brown pup tended to pause, almost protective, making sure his sibling was safe before joining in. "You look like a scout," I said to the golden one, who immediately wagged his tail as if in agreement. "And you," I whispered to the brown pup, gently rubbing the streak along his nose. "You look like a Rusty." The names settled on them like they had been waiting all along. Scout and Rusty. My heart swelled just saying it out loud. That morning, after giving them more chicken and water, I decided it was time to head into town for supplies. I couldn't leave them alone, not yet, so I gathered an old laundry basket, lined it with a soft blanket, and carefully set them inside. They looked up at me with yawned eyes, then snuggled against each other as I carried the basket to the car. Driving through Maple Creek with 2 puppies in the passenger seat felt surreal. People in passing cars slowed to peek, some smiling, others pointing, and I realized their story was already spreading hope beyond the gas station crowd. At the local pet store, I walked in with the basket in my arms, immediately drawing attention. A young employee behind the counter gasped, "Oh my gosh, they're adorable! Where did you get them?" I explained how I found them abandoned the night before. Her expression softened, a mix of sadness and admiration. "They're lucky you came along," she said. Scout yawned loudly, and the employee chuckled. "Looks like he agrees." I filled a cart with everything I thought I might need. Puppy food, small bowls, a pair of soft collars, a bag of training pads, and a couple of toys shaped like bones. At the register, the cashier leaned over to peek at the basket. "These 2 are going to have quite the story to tell someday," she said warmly. "Take good care of them." Her words lingered with me as I drove back home, thinking about how their lives had nearly ended in silence, and now, only a day later, strangers were rooting for them. Back at the house, Scout and Rusty bounded clumsily across the living room as soon as I let them out of the basket. Their energy amazed me. It was as if food, water, and a safe place had unlocked something inside them. Scout grabbed one of the new toys, a squeaky bone, and dragged it proudly across the floor, while Rusty barked softly, the sound so tiny it made me laugh. I watched them, sitting on the couch with the overwhelming realization that my quiet, predictable life had shifted completely, and I wasn't sad about it one bit. That afternoon, I called my parents to tell them what had happened. My mom, always practical but with a soft spot for animals, listened patiently before finally saying, "You did the right thing, honey. Bringing them home was what your heart told you to do." My dad chuckled in the background, adding, "Guess we'll be bringing dog biscuits next time we visit." Their support made me feel even more certain that keeping Scout and Rusty was the right path. The first real test came that evening when I took them outside into the backyard. The grass was slightly damp from the morning dew that hadn't fully lifted, and the puppies hesitated at the edge of the porch steps. Scout bounded down first, slipping on the last step and landing on his belly, which made him shake his head in confusion before trying again. Rusty whined softly, but when I knelt down and called his name, he took a brave leap and landed beside his brother. Watching them explore the yard together was like watching freedom unfold. They tumbled through the grass, sniffing every blade, and paused to chase a butterfly that darted past. Their joy was contagious. I found myself laughing again, a sound that felt foreign and familiar all at once. Later, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of pink and orange, Scout and Rusty curled up on the porch beside me, exhausted from their little adventure. I stroked their soft fur, feeling their breaths slow as they drifted to sleep. In that moment, I thought about the strangers at the gas station who had stood around us the night before, how they had been part of this miracle. Those strangers would probably never know how the story continued, but I carried their hope with me, a reminder that kindness could ripple out further than we imagine. Days turned into a week, and the house settled into a rhythm. Scout and Rusty grew stronger each day, their personalities becoming clearer. Scout was bold, curious, and always the first to try new things. Rusty was calmer, gentler, always staying close to Scout, but also quick to crawl into my lap for quiet moments. They learned quickly, surprising me with how fast they figured out where to eat, where to nap, and even how to nudge at the back door when they needed to go outside. The training pads came in handy, but their determination made me proud. I realized they weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Neighbors began to notice too. One Saturday morning, as I walked them down the sidewalk with their tiny new collars and leashes, a man mowing his lawn stopped and waved. "Those the pups from the gas station?" he asked. I nodded, surprised he knew. "My sister saw you that night," he explained. "Told me how you scooped them up. Folks around here have been talking. It's a good thing you did." His words made me blush slightly, but I also felt a swell of pride. Scout tugged at the leash, eager to sniff a flower bed, while Rusty leaned against my leg. The man grinned. "Looks like they already know they're loved." That evening, I sat on the porch again, Scout curled at my feet and Rusty resting on my lap. The summer air was warm, crickets chirped, and the world felt calm in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I thought about how much had changed in such a short time. It was almost as though Scout and Rusty had been sent to remind me of something I'd forgotten, that life is fuller when you let love in. Over the next few days, little moments began stacking up, weaving themselves into memories I knew I would carry forever. The way Scout barked proudly after catching his first tennis ball, even though it was almost bigger than his head. The way Rusty would fall asleep with his paw draped over Scout, always touching, always connected. The way both of them would sit by the front door when I left for work, their eyes wide with trust, and then leap into my arms when I returned, as if I had been gone a year instead of hours. One evening, I received a call from a woman named Karen, who introduced herself as one of the strangers from that night at the gas station. She said she had gotten my number from the cashier at the pet store. "I just wanted to check in," she said. "I couldn't stop thinking about those puppies. How are they doing?" I told her about Scout and Rusty, how they were eating well, playing, and growing more confident each day. She sighed with relief. "That's wonderful. You know, seeing you take them home that night, it restored something in me. A belief that even in small towns, even in the quiet corners of life, big miracles happen." Her words filled me with warmth. I realized then that Scout and Rusty weren't just changing my life. They were touching others too, even people they hadn't seen since that night. That night, after hanging up the phone, I sat on the floor as the puppies tumbled over each other, play fighting with soft growls and wagging tails. I watched them, smiling, and thought about how one act of compassion had turned into something larger than I could have imagined. This was only the beginning, and I knew Scout and Rusty had much more ahead of them, not just with me, but with the people they would continue to inspire. For now, though, I let the simple joy of their presence fill the room, their tiny barks echoing like music in the house that no longer felt empty. The following weeks brought changes I hadn't anticipated, the kind that sneak up on you slowly and then suddenly feel monumental. Scout and Rusty had settled into the house as if they had always belonged there. Their paws pattered across the floor in the early mornings when the sun cast golden light through the curtains. Their noses pressed against my leg as I poured my first cup of coffee. The sound of them playing, those tiny yips and tumbling growls, had become the background music of my days. It wasn't just that they were surviving anymore. They were thriving, and they were pulling me along with them into a life I hadn't realized I was missing. One particular morning, I woke to Scout tugging on the blanket, growling softly in the way he always did when he wanted me up and moving. Rusty sat just behind him, wagging his tail, letting Scout be the leader, but clearly in on the plan. I rolled over and groaned. All right, I'm up." Their tails thumped against the hardwood floor, and I laughed as they darted ahead of me toward the back door, ready for the day's adventure. The yard had become their kingdom, every blade of grass examined, every stick claimed as treasure. Rusty's careful sniffing contrasted Scout's reckless bounding, and somehow it all worked perfectly together. That day, I decided to take them beyond the yard. The leash training had been clumsy at first, Scout straining against it, Rusty hesitating with every step, but they were learning quickly. I clipped on their tiny collars and led them out into the quiet neighborhood street. The late summer air carried the smell of cut grass and warm pavement. Children were riding bikes a few houses down, and when they spotted the puppies, they screeched to a stop and rushed over. "Can we pet them?" one asked breathlessly. I knelt down, steadying the puppies as small hands reached out. Scout licked a girl's fingers eagerly, while Rusty leaned back at first, then cautiously pressed his head against another child's palm. Their laughter rang out, clear and bright, and for a moment I saw how powerful their presence could be, how just by existing they sparked joy in others. Word spread quickly around town about the gas station puppies, as people had taken to calling them. At the grocery store, a cashier recognized me and asked, "How are they doing? My aunt told me she saw you that night." She couldn't stop talking about how it gave her hope. At the local diner, a waitress paused while refilling my coffee and said, "Those little guys have become sort of a legend around here. People love hearing updates." It amazed me how far their story had traveled, how two fragile lives left behind in a box were now touching hearts in places I never expected. But raising puppies wasn't without its trials. One rainy afternoon, Scout managed to chew through a shoe I had left by the door. I discovered it only after he came prancing into the living room, the shredded laces dangling from his mouth like a prize. "Scout," I said, half scolding, half laughing, because his proud little strut made it impossible to be angry. Rusty, meanwhile, was more of a quiet troublemaker. I found him one evening curled up in the laundry basket, surrounded by socks he had somehow pulled from the dryer. He wagged his tail sheepishly, and I couldn't help but shake my head. "You two are lucky you're cute," I muttered, kissing the top of Rusty's head. Every mistake, every chewed shoe or knocked over lamp, felt like part of the process of building something bigger. These weren't just mishaps. They were reminders that life was messy, unpredictable, and somehow better when shared with them. The house that once echoed with silence was now filled with the constant hum of life. One Saturday, I decided to take them to Maple Creek Park. It was the heart of the town, a wide stretch of green fields, a playground, and a winding path that circled a small pond. I loaded Scout and Rusty into the car, their eager faces pressed against the window as we drove. When we arrived, people immediately noticed them. Families walking their own dogs paused to ask about them, and I retold their story again and again, each time watching faces soften with compassion. Scout tugged me toward the playground, where children giggled as he bounded toward them, while Rusty stayed closer, sniffing curiously, but always glancing back at me as if to make sure I was near. We ended up sitting near the pond. The puppies sprawled across my legs. The late afternoon sun shimmered on the water, and I thought about how far they'd come. Just weeks ago, they had been shivering in a cardboard box, barely holding on. Now, they were little ambassadors of hope, drawing strangers together and reminding people of the goodness in small acts of kindness. As I stroked their fur, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for finding them, but for everything they had brought into my life and the lives of others. One of the more touching moments came a few days later when a young couple stopped me during an evening walk. They had heard about Scout and Rusty from a friend. The woman knelt down, tears welling in her eyes as she petted Rusty. "We've been trying to start a family," she explained softly. "It's been hard, but seeing these two, hearing about how they were saved, it reminds me to keep believing, that miracles happen, even in unexpected ways." Her husband nodded, his arm around her shoulders. I felt my throat tighten, realizing once again how Scout and Rusty weren't just mine. They were becoming part of something larger, weaving themselves into the stories of people they'd never met. The puppies themselves continued to surprise me with their bond. At night, even though I had set up 2 separate little beds for them, they always ended up in one, curled around each other in a tight circle. If one stirred, the other would nuzzle closer. During play, even when Scout darted ahead with all his boldness, Rusty always caught up, never letting the distance grow too wide. Their loyalty to each other was something pure, something rare. Watching them made me reflect on my own relationships, the people I had let drift away, and the connections I wanted to nurture more intentionally. One evening, as the sky turned lavender and the first stars appeared, I sat on the porch with Scout and Rusty at my feet. A neighbor walking her dog stopped and called out, "You know, those two have become the pride of this street." She smiled warmly before continuing her walk, and I realized she was right. These puppies had gone from forgotten to cherished, from nearly invisible to unforgettable. Their story wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation, about what happens when love steps in where there was none to. That night, I wrote down everything that had happened since finding them. I didn't want to forget the details, the way Scout barked at his reflection in the mirror, the way Rusty tilted his head when I sang along to the radio, the way strangers' faces lit up when they heard about them. I wrote because I knew someday I'd want to look back and remember how 2 little lives had changed so much. And as I closed my notebook, Scout and Rusty shifted in their sleep, their tiny bodies pressed close together, breathing in rhythm. The sound filled the room with a peace that I hadn't known in years. I smiled to myself, realizing that this was only the beginning. Their journey, and mine with them, was unfolding day by day, and I couldn't wait to see where it would lead next. By the time September rolled around, the days grew shorter and the air cooler, yet Scout and Rusty seemed only to grow bigger and brighter, their energy filling every corner of the house. I had learned to wake up before them because the moment they opened their eyes, the house was alive with their playful chaos. Scout would grab whatever toy was closest and parade it proudly, while Rusty's softer side showed in the way he would nuzzle against my arm before bounding after his brother. Life had taken on a rhythm centered around their needs, and I didn't mind one bit. In fact, I welcomed the change, because it gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't realized I was missing. It was around this time that my neighbor Tom, a middle-aged man with a golden retriever of his own, stopped by the fence one morning as I let the puppies out to the yard. His dog, Daisy, wagged her tail happily as Scout and Rusty barked at her with excitement. "Looks like you've got your hands full," Tom chuckled. "But they're good pups. Word is still going around town about how you found them. Folks at church were just talking about it last Sunday." I smiled, surprised yet again by how much their story had traveled. Tom went on, "It's nice to see something good spread around for a change. Makes people feel like the world's still got plenty of kindness left in it." His words stayed with me long after he walked away. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Scout and Rusty weren't just my companions. They were becoming a symbol for the town. At the grocery store, people asked for updates. At the park, strangers stopped to pet them. Even the local librarian asked me one day if she could share their story during children's reading hour. I agreed, and a week later I brought the puppies into the library. The kids gasped in delight when Scout pranced in with his new red collar, Rusty shyly at his side. The librarian read aloud a story about friendship, and afterward, the children were allowed to pet the puppies. Scout basked in the attention, licking little hands eagerly, while Rusty, though cautious at first, eventually pressed his head into a boy's lap. The room filled with laughter, and I watched in awe at the joy radiating from such a simple moment. On the drive home, I whispered to them, "You too are changing lives, even if you don't know it." Training them became the next challenge. Scout's boldness often meant he rushed ahead without listening, while Rusty, though more obedient, was sometimes too timid. I signed us up for a local puppy class at the community center, figuring it would be good for all of us. The class was filled with families, retirees, and young couples, each with their own dogs. Some were tiny, yapping terriers, others big, lumbering hounds. Scout and Rusty quickly stole the spotlight, not because they were the best behaved, but because of the way they worked together. If Scout bolted toward a toy, Rusty followed right behind, keeping him in check. If Rusty hesitated at a command, Scout barked encouragingly until he moved forward. The trainer laughed more than once. "These two have a connection most dogs don't," she said. "It's something special. You've got yourself a team here." Hearing those words made me beam with pride. Back home, evenings grew into a new tradition. I would sit on the porch swing as the sun dipped low, Scout and Rusty tumbling across the yard until they finally collapsed in a heap beside me. Neighbors often strolled by, some stopping to chat. One woman told me she'd been going through a difficult time after losing her job, but hearing about the puppies had reminded her to keep moving forward. Another man admitted that he'd been feeling lonely since his wife passed, but seeing Scout and Rusty together reminded him of the comfort companionship could bring. These conversations opened my eyes to how far-reaching their impact truly was. They weren't just my dogs. They had become a thread in the fabric of the whole community. One Saturday morning, I decided to take Scout and Rusty to the farmer's market downtown. The air was crisp, the smell of apples and baked bread filling the streets. I carried them in at first because the crowd was dense, but once we reached the main square, I set them down on their leashes. Almost immediately, people swarmed. Children crouched to pet them. Adults asked to take pictures, and vendors smiled as the puppies sniffed at their booths. A baker slipped me a bag of dog-friendly biscuits. "On the house," she said warmly, "for the heroes of Maple Creek." I laughed, shaking my head at the nickname, but inside I felt proud. The farmer's market visit turned into something unforgettable when Scout tugged me toward a booth run by a woman selling handmade scarves. As I apologized and tried to pull him back, she knelt down to scratch his ears. Tears sprang to her eyes as Rusty pressed close beside him. "I lost my dog last winter," she said softly. "I didn't think I could smile at another pup again. But these two, they remind me of the love I had. Thank you for bringing them here." Her words were like a quiet revelation. I hadn't realized just how healing their presence could be to people carrying unseen grief. That moment stayed with me, etched into the memory of the day as something truly profound. The puppies continued to grow, not just in size but in spirit. Scout learned to fetch with unstoppable enthusiasm, while Rusty perfected the art of curling into my lap, no matter how big he got. Their antics filled my days with laughter, but it was their bond that amazed me most. They never strayed far from one another, always touching in some way, whether it was a paw resting on the other's back or noses pressed together as they fell asleep. Their devotion was unshakable, and in it, I saw a reflection of the kind of loyalty people longed for in their own lives. As autumn leaves began to scatter across the yard, I realized that life had shifted entirely around these two. They had turned my house into a home, my days into something worth anticipating, and my community into a circle bound by shared kindness. And though every day with them felt like a gift, I knew this was still only the beginning of their story. There was more ahead, more lessons, more joy, more lives touched by the simple yet extraordinary love of two puppies who had once been abandoned and forgotten, only to become unforgettable to everyone who met them. October arrived with crisp mornings and leaves crunching underfoot, and by now Scout and Rusty had grown into sturdy little adventurers who thought the whole world was theirs to explore. Their paws had outgrown the tiny collars I had bought at the start, and I had to upgrade them to larger ones, red for Scout and blue for Rusty. Walking them through Maple Creek had become a ritual that people anticipated. Children would run out from porches to greet them. Elderly neighbors waved from rocking chairs, and even the mailman kept treats in his pocket just for them. What had begun as a quiet rescue had turned into something much bigger, and I found myself marveling daily at the joy they brought not only to me, but to so many others. One chilly morning, we set out early along the winding path of the town's nature trail. Scout bounded ahead, ears flopping with every leap, while Rusty trotted close behind, glancing at me often as though checking that we were safe. The trees arched above us in fiery reds and golds, and the ground was speckled with fallen leaves that crunched under the puppy's paws. About halfway down the trail, a jogger slowed and smiled. "Are those the gas station puppies?" he asked, his breath clouding in the cool air. When I nodded, he grinned. "I've heard about them at work. People say they're kind of a local miracle." I laughed, a little embarrassed, but I couldn't deny that the two wagging tails at my feet were more than ordinary. That weekend, Tom invited us to join him and Daisy at the dog park just outside town. Scout and Rusty had never been around so many dogs at once, and I worried how they would react. But as soon as we stepped inside, Scout sprinted toward a group of playful retrievers, tail wagging furiously. Rusty hesitated, looking back at me for reassurance, but with a gentle nudge, he followed. Within minutes, they were darting across the grass, weaving between larger dogs, fearless in their play. People began to gather, curious about the pair, and soon I found myself retelling the story once again. One woman wiped her eyes after hearing it. "You don't know how much I needed to hear that today," she whispered. "My mother's been sick, and I've been so discouraged. But seeing them, hearing how they made it through, it reminds me not to give up." Her words reminded me how much Scout and Rusty were becoming more than pets. They were symbols of endurance and hope. Later that week, an invitation arrived from the local elementary school. The principal had heard about the puppies and asked if I would bring them for a visit. The idea of walking into a classroom full of children with two excitable pups felt daunting, but I couldn't say no. On the morning of the visit, Scout and Rusty trotted proudly down the hallway, their collars jingling. The moment we entered the classroom, the children gasped in unison. Tiny hands shot up, eager to ask questions. What are their names? How old are they? Do they like to cuddle? Scout soaked up the attention, licking cheek and wagging furiously, while Rusty found a quiet corner where a shy little boy sat apart from the group. Rusty curled against him, resting his head on the boy's knee, and the boy's eyes lit up with a smile that seemed to surprise even him. The teacher later told me the boy rarely spoke up or engaged in class, but that morning he wouldn't stop thinking about his new friend, Rusty. Driving home afterward, I realized again that these puppies were teaching lessons I could never plan. They were reaching hearts in ways beyond words. As Halloween approached, the town organized its annual festival in the square. Families came in costumes, booths lined the sidewalks, and the air smelled of kettle corn and hot cider. I wasn't sure how Scout and Rusty would handle the crowd, but they strutted through like little celebrities. A local boutique had even made them tiny pumpkin costumes, which they wore proudly, drawing laughter and endless photos. Strangers stopped to pet them, to hear their story, to tell me how much they meant to the town. At one point, a small group gathered around, and I found myself speaking without even thinking, sharing how they had taught me about resilience, companionship, and the power of community. People clapped, and I realized it wasn't just me who saw their importance. Everyone did. They had become part of Maple Creek's story. One evening after the festival, as the house grew quiet, I sat by the fireplace with Scout curled at my feet and Rusty stretched across my lap. The crackle of the flames filled the silence, and I thought about how different my life had become in just a couple of months. These dogs had pulled me out of routines that had once felt heavy and lifeless, replacing them with laughter, connection, and purpose. They had brought strangers together, mended quiet hurts, and given people a reason to believe in something good. And though I knew challenges would come, long nights, messes, the endless training, I felt ready for all of it. Because Scout and Rusty had already shown me that even the hardest starts could lead to something extraordinary. And I knew, deep in my heart, that this was only the beginning of a much bigger journey for all of us. November brought the first bite of winter, a sharpness in the air that turned each morning breath into a puff of mist. Scout and Rusty had grown stronger, their coats thickening as if nature itself was preparing them for the season ahead. My once quiet mornings now began with two eager faces pressed against my side of the bed, tails wagging insistently. They had made it clear. There would be no more sleeping in, not with adventures waiting outside. I bundled up in my coat and scarf, clipping on their leashes, and together we walked down frosted sidewalks, the crunch of leaves under our feet blending with the jingling of their collars. The town seemed to notice them even more during these walks, as if their story had only grown brighter with the turning of the season. The first snowfall came early that month, a soft dusting that blanketed Maple Creek overnight. I remember opening the door that morning, and Scout shot forward immediately, nose buried in the snow, tail wagging like mad. Rusty hesitated, his paws sinking uncertainly at first, until Scout bounded back, nipping gently at his ear as if to say, "Come on, it's safe." Rusty followed, and within seconds they were rolling, pawing, and chasing each other across the yard, leaving trails of joy in the pristine white. I laughed so hard I nearly cried, snapping pictures with my phone to capture the memory. Later, when neighbors walked by, they stopped to watch, smiling at the sight of two puppies discovering snow for the first time. It was one of those moments that felt like a gift, not just to me but to anyone who witnessed it. A week later, Scout and Rusty experienced another milestone, their first trip to the town's annual Thanksgiving parade. Bundled in tiny sweaters knitted by a kind woman from the farmer's market, they strutted proudly down Main Street at my side. People recognized them instantly. Children squealed their names, and adults stopped me to ask for updates. The mayor himself crouched down to scratch their ears, chuckling, "Looks like these boys are more famous than me." Floats rolled by with bright decorations. The high school marching band played festive tunes, and through it all, Scout and Rusty sat by my feet, calm and content despite the noise. They weren't just spectators. They were part of the celebration, little reminders of gratitude and hope walking right through the heart of town. Back at home, the quiet moments between events became just as meaningful. Scout loved to chase after tennis balls in the yard. Bounding so enthusiastically, he sometimes tumbled head over paws, while Rusty preferred curling up beside me on the couch as I read. Their different personalities balanced each other perfectly, and I often thought about how lucky it was that they had been found together. One evening, while I stirred a pot of soup in the kitchen, I looked over to see Scout and Rusty lying side by the fireplace, their breathing synchronized, their paws lightly touching. My chest tightened at the sight. Their bond was more than just companionship. It was a kind of unspoken promise between them, one that seemed to say, "We made it through the hard part, and we'll keep making it through together." The town continued to rally around them. A local newspaper ran a small feature titled, "From Abandoned to Beloved," the story of Scout and Rusty, complete with a picture of them in the snow. People cut it out and pinned it to bulletin boards, taped it to refrigerators, and carried it folded in their pockets. One afternoon at the grocery store, a woman stopped me to say, "Every time I look at that picture, I'm reminded that goodness is still alive in this world. Thank you for that." Her words brought tears to my eyes. I hadn't done anything extraordinary. I had just listened to my heart that night at the gas station. But Scout and Rusty had turned that simple act into something extraordinary, something people could hold on to when the days grew darker. As Thanksgiving neared, I was invited to bring Scout and Rusty to the community center's holiday dinner. The room was filled with long tables, the air rich with the scent of turkey, stuffing, and pies. Families bustled about, laughter mingling with clinking dishes. When we entered, the room seemed to brighten. Children rushed forward, calling their names, and even the adults couldn't resist kneeling down to pet them. Scout and Rusty wagged their tails, greeting everyone with eager licks and warm eyes. At one point, an elderly man in a wheelchair reached out, and Rusty immediately pressed his head into his hand. The man's eyes filled with tears. "I had a dog once long ago," he whispered. "I didn't think I'd feel this again." The room grew quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words, before conversation slowly resumed, richer somehow because of that shared emotion. Later that evening, as I drove us home, Scout curled up in the passenger seat and Rusty nestled against my arm. The town's Christmas lights were already going up, glowing warmly against the chill. I thought about how their story had become woven into Maple Creek itself, how their journey from abandonment to belonging had touched people in ways I never could have predicted. And I realized that what we were building together wasn't just about me or the dogs. It was about the kind of love that spreads outward, igniting hope in places where it had grown dim. When we arrived home, Scout leapt out of the car, eager as always, while Rusty followed closely behind. They bounded up the porch steps and sat side by side at the door, waiting for me to let them in. I paused for a moment, looking at them under the glow of the porch light, their breath visible in the cold air, their eyes bright with trust. And I knew that as wonderful as these past months had been, there was still so much more ahead. More memories, more lessons, more ways their lives would touch mine and countless others. December arrived with a flurry of snow that turned Maple Creek into a postcard scene. Lights twinkled on rooftops, wreaths hung from doors, and the town square sparkled with a giant tree at its center. For Scout and Rusty, it was their first real winter, and every day brought new discoveries. Scout would bury his nose in the snowdrifts until his whole face was white, while Rusty delighted in chasing snowflakes as they fell, snapping at the air with his little jaws. I bundled them into cozy sweaters knitted by a neighbor, one striped red and green for Scout, and one deep blue with little white snowflakes for Rusty. People on the street stopped constantly to smile and wave, some crouching down to greet them, others calling out, "There go the Christmas puppies!" One evening early in the month, the town held its annual tree lighting ceremony. Scout and Rusty walked proudly on their leashes as we joined the crowd. The square buzzed with carols, children holding hot cocoa, and families bundled in scarves. When the mayor gave the signal and the lights flickered on, gasps filled the air. The enormous tree glowed with golden light, ornaments catching the reflections of the crowd. At that moment, Scout barked happily, and Rusty pressed against my leg as if sensing the magic of it all. A woman beside me whispered, "Those two make it even more special. They're like little miracles walking among us." I didn't say anything, just smiled, because I couldn't have agreed more. As Christmas approached, invitations poured in. Friends and neighbors wanted Scout and Rusty to visit, to spread a little cheer. We attended a holiday fair at the community center, where the puppies trotted through rows of decorated booths, wagging their tails at everyone. Children tugged their parents' sleeves, calling out, "Look, it's them!" One family asked if they could take a picture with the dogs in front of the giant gingerbread house display. Scout licked the candy cane prop immediately, while Rusty tilted his head, curious. The photo ended up printed in the local paper, captioned, "Spreading holiday joy, one paw at a time." At home, the holiday spirit filled our little house too. I decorated a modest tree in the living room, hanging ornaments carefully while Scout and Rusty watched. Of course, Scout tried to tug at the garland, and Rusty managed to curl up beneath the tree as though he belonged there. On Christmas Eve, I wrapped a couple of small gifts for them, new squeaky toys and soft blankets. Watching their tails wag as they pawed at the wrapping paper was the best gift I could have asked for. I sat on the couch that night, sipping cocoa, as Scout and Rusty curled into their new blankets, their faces peaceful in the glow of the tree lights. It struck me then that this Christmas, unlike many before, didn't feel quiet or lonely. It felt whole. But the most unforgettable moment came on Christmas Day itself. I had been invited to join a community dinner at the church, and I decided to bring Scout and Rusty along. The hall was filled with long tables covered in red and green tablecloths, the air rich with the smell of turkey and pies. Laughter echoed off the walls as families and friends gathered. When we entered, a hush fell over part of the room, followed by excited murmurs. Children rushed forward, calling the puppies by name. Elderly couples leaned forward to watch them with fond smiles. As we moved through the hall, people reached out to pet them, to thank me for bringing them, to share how much their story had meant over the past months. At one point, Scout hopped onto a bench beside a young girl who was sitting quietly alone. She looked up in surprise, her face lighting with the brightest smile I'd seen all day. Rusty soon joined, resting his head on her lap, and within minutes she was laughing and hugging them. Her mother came over, eyes shining, and whispered to me, "She's been so shy since we moved here. This is the first time she's felt like she belongs." The rest of the evening was filled with moments like that. Moments where Scout and Rusty reminded people that joy could be simple, that love could be found in the most unexpected places. On the drive home, I glanced at them curled together in the back seat, their tiny snores filling the quiet car. I whispered, "You've given people more than you'll ever know." The days after Christmas passed with a calm sweetness. Snow continued to fall, and each morning Scout and Rusty raced outside to leave new tracks in the yard. I took them on long walks down snowy streets lined with glowing lights, neighbors waving as we passed. At home, we settled into a cozy rhythm of fireside evenings, their warm bodies pressed against me as I read or wrote. I began journaling more, wanting to capture every detail, every memory. Because I knew these days were precious, not just for me, but for the community that had embraced Scout and Rusty as its own. And as the year drew to a close, I realized with certainty that the new one would bring even more opportunities for them to touch lives, to spread hope, and to remind everyone that even the smallest beginnings could lead to the brightest stories. The new year arrived with fireworks bursting above Maple Creek, their reflections dancing across the snow. I stood on the porch that night with Scout and Rusty at my feet, their ears twitching at every crackle in the sky. Scout barked loudly, tail wagging furiously, while Rusty leaned against my leg, eyes wide but calm, watching the lights. I whispered to them, "This year is going to be even better. You'll see." And I believed it, because the past few months had already shown me how quickly life could transform with a little love. January brought icy mornings and frosty breath that lingered in the air. Scout and Rusty seemed unfazed by the cold, bounding into snowdrifts with endless energy, their paws leaving little trails across the yard. The town had quieted after the holidays, but the puppies still brought excitement wherever they went. On one walk, we passed the bakery, and the owner leaned out the door with a grin. "Well, if it isn't Maple Creek's finest," she said, tossing them each a small dog treat she'd set aside. People waved from cars, called out their names, even honked in greeting. The puppies wagged their tails at every bit of attention, their story now a part of the town's heartbeat. One weekend, Tom invited us to join him and Daisy for a hike along a forest trail. The trees were bare, branches coated in frost, but the ground was firm and clear. Scout bounded ahead with Daisy, their energy matching, while Rusty trotted beside me, occasionally darting forward to catch up, but always returning to check that I was near. At one point, the trail opened to a frozen stream, and Scout skidded across the ice, barking with delight. Rusty hesitated, paws digging at the edge, until I knelt down and encouraged him gently, He stepped cautiously onto the ice, and when he realized it would hold, his tail wagged furiously as he chased after his brother. Tom laughed, shaking his head. "You've got some special dogs there. You can see it in how they move, how they care for each other." I nodded, feeling the truth in his words. That month also brought a new experience: puppy obedience classes at the town's training center. Scout, full of boundless energy, struggled at first to sit still. Rusty, quieter and more thoughtful, watched carefully and seemed to learn more quickly. Together, they balanced each other. If Scout grew restless, Rusty's calm presence steadied him. If Rusty hesitated, Scout's eagerness pulled him forward. Other owners often commented, "They're like two halves of one dog." The trainer praised their teamwork, telling me, "This kind of bond can't be taught. It's rare to see." Each class ended with applause as the puppies performed commands together, tails wagging in perfect unison. At home, life moved into a cozy rhythm. Scout often dragged his toys into the center of the living room, prancing proudly until Rusty inevitably joined the play. They wrestled gently, always careful, their laughter like yips echoing through the house. In quieter moments, Rusty climbed onto the couch, pressing close as I read or wrote, while Scout sprawled across the rug, content just to be nearby. Their presence had become so woven into my days that I couldn't imagine the house without them. In late January, the town hosted a winter festival. Booths lined Main Street, offering hot cider and handmade crafts, while children skated on the frozen pond. Scout and Rusty trotted proudly through the crowd, wearing knitted scarves gifted by a neighbor. People greeted them like old friends, bending down to stroke their fur, asking for stories. At one booth, a woman selling candles reached out with tears in her eyes. "I lost my husband last year," she said softly. "It's been hard to find reasons to smile, but seeing them today, it helps. Thank you for sharing them." Her words reminded me again how Scout and Rusty's story had grown far beyond me. They were healing hearts, one encounter at a time. The highlight of the festival came during the evening lantern release. Families gathered in the square, holding paper lanterns that glowed softly against the night sky. As we lit ours, Scout barked excitedly, while Rusty pressed close against my leg. Together, we watched as dozens of lanterns floated upward, filling the darkness with light. A child beside me whispered, "It feels like hope." And it did. The sight of those lanterns rising, mixed with the wagging tails at my feet, filled me with a deep certainty that the year ahead would hold even more moments like this. Moments of connection, of healing, of unforgettable joy. That night, back at home, I sat by the fire as Scout and Rusty curled together on the rug. Their breaths slowed, their bodies warm and safe, their paws resting lightly against each other. I thought about how far they had come from that cardboard box outside the gas station, and I realized that their story wasn't just about survival. It was about showing everyone, myself included, what it meant to keep choosing life, love, and hope, day after day. And as the fire crackled softly, I whispered into the quiet room, "We're just getting started." February arrived with bitter winds that swept across Maple Creek, but inside my home, warmth radiated from the two puppies who had turned the place into something alive. Scout and Rusty had grown bigger still, their paws sturdy now, their bodies strong, yet their hearts remained the same, always pressed close to one another, always moving as a pair. Every morning began with them bounding to the door, eager to start the day. And though the cold nipped at my fingers and toes, I couldn't deny the joy of watching them leap through snowdrifts, tails high against the gray sky. The town, too, seemed to find comfort in them during the long winter days. On walks down Main Street, people leaned out of shops to wave, calling their names as if they were old friends. The local coffee shop began setting out a water bowl just for them, and more than once, customers slipped them small treats while I ordered my coffee. Scout wagged his tail furiously at every encounter, while Rusty leaned his head against hands offered in kindness, his calm nature grounding Scout's boundless energy. I often thought about how different it could have been if no one had noticed them that night at the gas station, and the thought made me hold the leashes a little tighter, grateful for what had come instead. In the middle of the month, the community center hosted a Valentine's Day gathering. Families, couples, and friends came together for music, dancing, and games, and I was invited to bring Scout and Rusty along. I dressed them in matching red bandanas, and when we entered, the room brightened with recognition. Children rushed forward immediately, squealing their names, while adults bent down to greet them with warm smiles. Scout barked happily, running from one person to another, while Rusty found a spot beside an elderly woman in a wheelchair, resting his head on her lap. She stroked his fur slowly, whispering to me that her late husband had loved dogs, and that Rusty's gentle presence made her feel close to him again. Tears filled her eyes, and I realized once again that these puppies were carrying pieces of healing to people wherever they went. Later that night, during the gathering, a group of children asked if they could parade Scout and Rusty through the hall. I handed over the leashes, watching as the two pups walked proudly among them, tails wagging, as if they knew they were part of something special. The crowd clapped and cheered, the sound filling the room with warmth. When Scout barked and Rusty gave a small howl in response, the children burst into laughter. It was one of those moments where joy rippled outward, touching everyone present. As the weeks passed, the puppies continued to weave themselves deeper into the fabric of my days. Scout loved tug-of-war, prancing around with his rope toy in victory every time, while Rusty preferred curling beside me while I worked at the kitchen table. Their personalities shone brighter with each passing day. Scout bold and playful, Rusty gentle and steady, but it was their bond that amazed me most. No matter what they did, they always ended up side by side, as if drawn by an invisible string. Watching them reminded me constantly of the power of connection, of the importance of standing together and through whatever life brought. One particularly cold morning, I received a call from the local elementary school. They had heard how well the puppies had done during the last visit and asked if they could come again, this time to a special assembly about kindness. I agreed, and that afternoon, Scout and Rusty trotted proudly into the gymnasium. Rows of children sat cross-legged on the floor, their faces lighting up the moment the puppies appeared. The principal spoke about compassion and how even small actions could make a big difference, and then invited me to share Scout and Rusty's story. As I spoke, the children listened intently, their eyes wide. When I finished, Scout bounded forward to lick a little girl's cheek, while Rusty curled against a boy's side. The gym erupted in giggles, and I knew that lesson would linger far longer than any words could. At home in the evenings, I often found myself reflecting on all of it. The way strangers had become friends through Scout and Rusty. The way people found pieces of themselves reflected in their story. The way they had transformed my life in such a short time. One night, as the wind howled outside and snow tapped against the windows, I curled on the couch with them tucked against me, Scout's paw draped over Rusty as always. The fire flickered, casting a warm glow over the room, and I thought about how this was more than just a chapter in my life. It was a journey that was still unfolding, one that would carry us all into places I couldn't yet imagine. And as the puppies breathed softly in unison, I whispered into the quiet, "We're in this together. Always." March arrived with the first hints of spring peeking through the melting snow. The ground, still damp and muddy from winter, carried the scent of renewal. Scout and Rusty seemed to sense the change before I did. Their energy was different, more playful, more eager, as though the world itself was inviting them to run further, explore longer, and stretch into a new season of life. Each morning, when I opened the back door, they burst outside with tails wagging, leaping into the yard, where patches of grass pushed up through the receding snow. I stood at the doorway, smiling at the sight, realizing again how much these two had transformed not only my home, but also my perspective on the world. As the days grew warmer, our walks extended further. We ventured beyond the familiar sidewalks of Maple Creek into the surrounding trails that wound through the woods. The air was cool and damp, filled with the sound of dripping branches as the last of the ice melted away. Scout led the way, bounding ahead fearlessly, while Rusty stayed closer, pausing every so often to sniff carefully at new scents. One afternoon, we discovered a small clearing carpeted with early wildflowers. Scout darted among them, tail wagging furiously, while Rusty lay down in the middle, closing his eyes as if to soak in the peace. I sat on a fallen log, watching them, and thought about how different life had become in just a few months. What began as an unexpected rescue had grown into a journey that kept unfolding, full of small moments that stitched themselves into something unforgettable. The town, too, continued to embrace them as its own. At the grocery store, people stopped me in the aisles to ask about the puppies, sharing how much their story had meant during the long winter. At the post office, a clerk kept a jar of dog treats at her station, waiting for Scout and Rusty to visit. Even at the local diner, a waitress paused to scratch their ears whenever we passed. They weren't just pets anymore. They were part of the community's fabric, little reminders of resilience and love in a world that sometimes felt too heavy. One Saturday, Tom invited us to join him and Daisy for a longer hike outside town. The trail wound up into the hills, where the snow had melted more quickly, leaving muddy paths and bright green shoots of grass. Scout and Daisy bounded ahead together, while Rusty trotted beside me. At one point, we stopped at a lookout where the whole town stretched below us, its rooftops glinting in the sunlight. Rusty pressed close to my leg, while Scout stood at the edge, tail wagging proudly as if surveying the kingdom that had become his home. Tom chuckled. "It's something, isn't it? How much they've grown, how much they've changed everything." I nodded, knowing he was right. In mid-March, the elementary school invited us back again, this time for a reading event. The library was filled with children clutching books, their eyes lighting up when Scout and Rusty trotted in. The librarian asked if I would share their story again, and as I spoke, I watched the children's faces soften, their small hands reaching out to pet the pups when I finished. Scout licked a little girl's cheek, sending her into a fit of giggles, while Rusty curled beside a boy who had been sitting quietly at the edge of the group. The boy's teacher later told me that he had been struggling with confidence, but Rusty's calm presence seemed to bring him out of his shell. Walking home that afternoon, I realized once again that these puppies carried something bigger than themselves. They carried hope, and they shared it freely with anyone willing to pause and notice. Life at home shifted too. The puppies were growing quickly, no longer small enough to fit in a laundry basket, but still just as close to each other as they had been the first night. Scout continued to be bold, dragging toys across the living room with triumphant barks, while Rusty perfected the art of leaning against me, soaking up quiet moments. They balanced each other so perfectly that sometimes I wondered if they even knew how remarkable their bond was. At night, I often found them asleep in a tangled heap, their paws resting against each other, their breathing steady and synchronized. Watching them, I felt a calmness I hadn't known in years. As spring deepened, Maple Creek held its annual community fair. Booths lined Main Street, music filled the air, and families wandered with cotton candy in hand. Scout and Rusty trotted proudly on their leashes, their tails wagging as children pointed and called their names. A vendor handed me a bag of homemade dog biscuits, saying, "On the house. They've done more for this town than anyone could have guessed." People gathered around to hear the story again, each retelling weaving Scout and Rusty more deeply into the town's collective memory. At one point, a young couple approached, holding hands tightly. The woman knelt to pet Rusty, tears in her eyes. "We've been trying to start a family," she whispered. "It's been hard. But seeing them, seeing how they were given a second chance, it gives us hope." I swallowed hard, touched yet again by how far their story reached. Back at home after the fair, the puppies sprawled across the rug, exhausted from the day's excitement. I sat on the couch, watching them sleep, and thought about everything they had become to me, to the town, to the strangers whose lives they had brushed against. They were no longer just the puppies I had found in a cardboard box. They were symbols of something greater, something lasting. And as the days of March rolled on, filled with muddy paw prints, wagging tails, and countless small moments of joy, I knew there was still so much more to come. Their story was far from over, and I couldn't wait to see where it would lead us next. April arrived with warm breezes carrying the scent of blooming flowers, and Maple Creek seemed to come alive all at once. Trees unfurled new leaves, the grass turned lush and green, and the town buzzed with activity. Scout and Rusty thrived in the new season, their coats gleaming under the sun, their boundless energy propelling them into longer runs and more joyful explorations. Every morning when I opened the back door, they bolted outside, chasing each other through the yard, tumbling in the grass until they collapsed side by side, panting and content. Watching them in the golden light of spring mornings filled me with a gratitude that words couldn't fully capture. The town continued to embrace them as its own, and by now their names were known almost everywhere. On walks, children called out to them from porches, neighbors waved, and even the delivery drivers kept dog treats tucked in their pockets for when they stopped by. Scout wagged his tail at every bit of attention, soaking it in as though the world existed just to see him happy. Rusty, gentler and quieter, leaned against people's legs, offering comfort in a way that was softer but no less powerful. Together, they had become Maple Creek's little ambassadors of hope. Early in the month, we were invited to participate in the town's Easter festival. The square was decorated with pastel ribbons and baskets filled with candy, and children darted about in excitement for the egg hunt. When Scout and Rusty arrived, dressed in simple spring bandanas gifted by a neighbor, the children squealed with delight. They crowded around the puppies, petting them, hugging them, laughing at Scout's eager licks and Rusty's calm, steady gaze. At one point, a boy who had been standing apart, arms crossed, finally stepped forward when Rusty walked over and nudged his hand. The boy's face softened, and within moments he was kneeling beside Rusty, smiling for the first time that day. His mother whispered to me with tears in her eyes, "He's been having such a hard time fitting in lately. Thank you." I shook my head, knowing the thanks truly belonged to the dogs. That festival was filled with countless moments like that. A woman recovering from an illness bent to pet Scout and said quietly, "Seeing them reminds me to keep fighting." An older man paused with his cane, watching them with misty eyes, and murmured, "I had dogs like this once. They kept me going when times were hard." Each encounter showed me again how Scout and Rusty were weaving themselves into people's hearts, offering something simple yet profound. A reminder that love and resilience could be found in the most unexpected places. At home, the days stretched long and sweet. I spent afternoons in the yard while the puppies darted after butterflies, their bodies moving in perfect coordination as though they shared one heartbeat. Sometimes they flopped into the grass beside me, tongues lolling, eyes bright with the joy of living. In the evenings, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of pink and orange, we sat on the porch together, their warm bodies pressed against my legs. The crickets chirped, the air smelled of lilacs, and I thought about how different my life had become since the night I found them. What had started as an act of rescue had turned into a journey of transformation, not just for Scout and Rusty, but for me, and for everyone touched by their story. As April moved on, the town held a charity event to raise funds for the animal shelter. Scout and Rusty were invited as guests of honor, their story having inspired so many to care more deeply for animals in need. The event took place in the park, with booths selling food and crafts, music playing, and families gathered together. Scout strutted proudly through the crowd, wagging his tail furiously, while Rusty moved more gently, pressing his head against hands that reached out for him. When I was asked to speak, I stood before the gathered crowd with the two pups at my side and told their story once more, how they had been found abandoned in a cardboard box, how strangers had gathered that night to witness something unforgettable, how love had carried them into the lives of so many. As I spoke, the crowd grew quiet, listening intently. When I finished, Scout barked once, sharp and clear, and Rusty gave a soft howl, as if adding their voices to mine. The crowd erupted into applause, and I knew that this moment wasn't just about two puppies anymore. It was about everyone who had ever chosen kindness when it mattered most. After the event, as the sun set and Scout and Rusty curled against me in the grass, I realized how much their journey had grown beyond my little house. They had become more than companions, more than pets. They had become living reminders of hope, resilience, and the power of love to change everything. And though their story had begun with fear and uncertainty, it had unfolded into something beautiful, something lasting, something unforgettable. Looking at them, their eyes bright and trusting, I knew without question that this was the life we were meant to share. The crowd's laughter and cheers still echoed faintly in the distance, but the real music was here, in the steady rhythm of their breathing, the warmth of their fur against my hands, and the knowledge that together we had created something extraordinary that would never fade.